as ever with our land acknowledgement. We are gathering on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people. Since time immemorial, the Coast Salish have called Whidbey Island home, stewarding this bountiful land for millennia. We honor Coast Salish elders, their descendants, and future generations who continue their lifeways on and around Whidbey Island. All right, so this is a compilation of maps that were done by the Washington Territorial Assessors, showing the land claims that had been made up until 1863. I think it's terribly pretty. So we left last week with the Civil War, and as you might remember, the treaties had been negotiated in 1855. Congress had finally ratified them in 1859. And then everything starts to change demographically here on the island. So the Point Elliott Treaty, which was signed at Mukilteo, formed 4 different reservations: Lummi, Swinomish, Tulalip, and Port Madison. And only 2 of those reservation names are actually tribal names. The Lummi were a tribe, and so were the Swinomish. But the Swinomish reservation is peopled by more than just Swinomish people. It's peopled by many different bands from the foothills and around the coastline here. The Lower Skagit from Penn Cove were assigned to Swinomish, even though they were the most populous community here. They did not get their own reservation. They had to leave and go to Swinomish territory. So these are all the tribes that are having to make choices about where they go. Now, it was not assigned to them. They got to choose where they went. Many of the Penn Cove Skagit went to Swinomish. It's pretty close. A lot of them, though, went to Tulalip. A lot of Chief Snatelem's descendants went to Tulalip. It really depended on who you were intermarried with, who your family was, and where they were settling. So the Swinomish Reservation, this early map shows it up. There's Swinomish Slough there that you can see. The reservation is on the west side of the slough. LaConner now is on the right side. So this will give you a better idea here from Google Maps. This is approximately the boundary of the Swinomish Reservation. And so many of the leaders from Penn Cove went here. And you would think that that it's so close and that they knew each other so well that this would be comfortable for them. But the accounts are that it took decades, even generations, for different bands to identify with their reservation community instead of their bands or their tribes. So that when the Penn Cove Skagit moved to the Swinomish Reservation, they all had their own little neighborhoods within, which I think is a really fascinating about the way people self-segregate. They always want to be in their collective, their group they're most comfortable with, their family and their friends. And so the Penn Cove Skagit, for the most part, were settling on the west side, looking out over Similk Bay in this direction, instead of at the slough towards LaConner. Many of the others went to Tulalip. Most of you probably know where Tulalip is on the mainland, just north of Everett. The interesting thing about the way the reservations panned out was that for a long time, people thought that Penn Cove Special Indian Agency would become a permanent reservation, and that would be where people were settled. But in the end, it was not chosen for that. And I'm not really sure why that is. I don't know if anyone actually knows, but the government, the federal government, really wanted to see ultimately over time that all native peoples would end up in this region, would end up at Tulalip. So the bulk of what you see as maybe tribal reservation society evolving the missionaries are going to go to Tulalip first. There's just going to be more administrative, bureaucratic support at Tulalip, and especially for those Penn Cove Skagit who had been touched by the missionaries here and considered themselves Catholic. It was a good enough reason to go to Tulalip over Swinomish. So most of you probably have heard about some of the really horrific stories that come out of the legacy of Indian boarding schools. There certainly was in the 1860s the establishment of a Catholic mission headed by Father Charus on the Tulalip Reservation, and he actually missionized all over, including at the Swinomish. He set up schools, and this particular picture, and I'm sorry, that was supposed to not be there. Hold on a second. I'm going to fix this and take away the girls with the nuns. They had boys' schools and girls' schools, but I'm going to take them away so that we can see the good father. And okay, so Father Charus was devoted, as some of the Catholic missionaries had been on the east side of the Cascades during the Yakima Wars. He was dedicated to the people at the reservation, to educating kids, teaching the parents how to farm, make good Christians out of them, good Euro Christians out of them. With all the atrocities that we know did happen at Tulalip Indian Boarding School, it looks like that tradition, that the dark years of that didn't really get underway until later in the 19th century. So that from all accounts that I can hear, Native peoples remember Father Charus very fondly. And maybe that somebody will tell me that's not true, but I've heard from multiple sources that he was held in high regard. This particular picture of him with his Tulalip schoolboys was taken here on Penn Cove in Coupeville in 1865, I believe it is. So many of the lower Skagit here never went back to the reservation or waited decades to go back to the reservation, so that it was still a really common sight to see Native people fishing around the cove, around Whidbey Island, still living on the beaches, still long houses on the beaches. And in fact, this couple here, some of you may know him, Chief Charlie Snatelam, he and his wife, he spent his whole life here. He never did go to the reservations. So it was easier to do here than just about anywhere else because of the rural nature of Whidbey Island. And also, it's the 1880 census, which is a little bit farther down the line. The 1880 census, though, shows that there are more non-reservation Native people living in Island County than in any other county in the Washington Territory. So it was a place where it was more possible to live in your homeland than in other places. So these are just some of the pictures that will come up later in the 19th century of gatherings of Native peoples, while Coupeville, not just Coveland, but Coupeville are moving along and growing at a good clip. The last potlatch, I understand, that was held on Penn Cove was in 1905. So that's almost a half a century of Native presence after the reservations are established. So the white guys, the first settlers that are coming here, as you know, are Isaac Eby starts, and he's farming, and many of them are coming to farm. And what I'm trying to show you with this map and this close-up is that when the U.S. Coast Survey came through and drew these maps, they actually noted where there were houses and where there were cultivated fields. So this red square is the donation land claim of Isaac Eby, 1 square mile. But by the time they came through in, what's the date on that? 1858, only this little square and this little square were actually under cultivation. So that obviously part of that is the fact that he came out here without, when he came out, he didn't have any oxen, he didn't have any power equipment, and the prairie was full of other kinds of plants. So, you know, you had your snowberries and your wild roses and your Oregon grape. And then where it was being cultivated, it was full of bracken fern that was said to be as tall as a man. And, you know, the rhizomes of that bracken fern, well, if you've had it in your garden, you know how hard it is to get rid of. It just became this impenetrable web, so that Evie would say that when they had a plow and a horse, it would take 3 people to break the ground. You had one to lead the horse, one to stand on to guide the plow, and then the third person had to stand on the back bar to give it enough weight to break up the bracken rhizomes. So it was pretty hard work, and this was as much as E.B. ever got broken in his life here. So John Crockett and. Okay, so the first settlers here, that was John Crockett. We had Richard Lansdale up here, who the Indian doctor. And when I say Indian doctor, he practiced medicine with the Indians. The Hill brothers set up their farm down here. The Crockett's family set up their farm down here. I think between the Ebys and the Crocketts, there were 30 family members. It was a pretty big group of people. So Coveland is establishing up here, but the farmers are all obviously out where the good prairies are. All right, what am I missing? Why is that? Oh, okay. I'm sorry, I've confused myself with all my stars. I'm sorry. So so the other early settlers, this would be before 1855, would be John Alexander and Thomas Coupe. John Alexander was a farmer. Thomas Coupe was a sea captain, as I think we all know. So one of the early residents here, named J. Thomas Turner, recalls what it was like back in the very early days, and I'm including it just because I think it's a pretty good survey of really just subsistence existence, what you could get, and think it was good. Okay. In those early days of pioneer life on Puget Sound, the settlers, men and women, had a hard struggle to get along. Far from their base of supplies in San Francisco, provisions and clothing were very high. Flour, $40 a barrel, and all other provisions in proportion. But we had the never-failing Wapato, dried salmon and dried clams, as well as those that were not dried and smoked. We had plenty of game. Deer came into our front yards and gardens. Boy, does that sound familiar. Ate our pea vines and the bark from our apple trees, and the Indians kept us well supplied with fish, both shell and scale, and venison, and game was so plentiful, it palled our appetites. So even in 1852, they at least were not starving here. Wapato is, what is it? Oh. Wapiti. Wapato is it's a bulb, it's a Sagittarius. What's that? Not the zodiac sign, but Sagittarius. It's a plant. It's a I think it's a marsh plant. It has a starchy bulb like a potato. So I think that I remember, no, it's not cattails, but I remember reading that on Lake Washington that native girls would harvest the Wapato because the roots were underneath the shoreline. They'd go in with their toes and squiggle into the wet mud and pull the Wapato out. So the land claims, and we talked about the land claims earlier and how certain kinds of people, depending on where they came from, settled in different places. And we had our sea captains. The sea captains are really the primary reason that I think that the community, the established community, rather than the farms, where services could be held, where you would have Island County. The county seat of Island County was at Coveland, was because this is where trade was going to take place. It was the New England men. So here you have in blue, Captain Barstow, Captain Holbrook, Captain Hathaway, and Captain Coupe in purple. These are the sea captains, but they're not the only ones that settled here. There were a lot of sea captains that settled here. Maybe you've heard Coupeville called the city of sea captains before. before. But you will find their names in our streets, like Kinney and Clapp, Swift. These are other sea captains that settled here. So there's really at least a dozen who left an imprint on the community, even though they didn't make land claims. And a lot of their houses are still standing. And next week, I want to do a little survey on matching up the houses that you pass every day with some of these historic figures that we've talked about. Thomas Coupe, of course, gets to be. I read an article. It was a little news blurb that I saw at the museum from a Trenton, New Jersey newspaper about famous taverns, and it was published in the 1960s, and it tells the story of how Coupeville got its name. I don't know why Trenton, New Jersey cared how Coupeville got its name, but they claimed that that everybody in Coupeville threw their name in a hat to name the town, and it was Thomas Coupe's name that came out, so he got the honor of it. So I would thought that Alexanderville would be a little bit too unwieldy. So the shipping starts immediately before the donation land claims have started to take up all the land and the farmers have started to till. Walter Crockett, who was here in 1853, wrote, "When I came to this country a year ago, there was only 5 vessels trading into Puget Sound. And at this time, there is upwards of 50 vessels coming regularly into those waters and is shipping timbers, fish, and coal to San Francisco. Admiralty Inlet is the great highway for all the shipping that arrives in Puget Sound." And this is true, reading EB journals, whether it's Winfield or Isaacs, they're always recording which vessels they can see coming through Admiralty Inlet on their way to Port Townsend. It's amazing to me that they can tell which vessels they are from over here, but they kept a pretty good record. Isaac Eby thought that this was going to be the Puget Sound would be the greatest commercial port of the West, and he was close to right. So if you'd been here in the early 1850s, even though that was there were native villages all along, the treaties hadn't been signed yet, you would have seen these tall ships in Penn Cove, often in a sea of floating timbers, because timber was the big industry here. You know, Camano and Whidbey Island just got cleared. All our forests were sent off to San Francisco to build their wharves and their buildings. You know, California just didn't have that kind of wood. So it's hard to imagine these big gracious vessels in our waters, but this was pretty common in the 1850s and 60s before steam and power vessels started to come in. So obviously, wherever there is commerce, there's going to be a town, or wherever there's a town, there's going to be commerce. So some of the early trading posts that were at the far west end of the Cove was one of them was Barstow's trading post, and that is not far, a stone's throw from where the Captain Whidbey Inn is right now. And one of their advertisements in the papers around the Sound states, "BP Barstow and Company will keep constantly on hand provisions and groceries of all kinds, also clothing, boots and shoes, cooking stoves, etc., etc. They are receiving by each of their vessels from San Francisco large supplies and can furnish to the people and merchants of the Sound goods lower than they can be procured at any other point." So head on down to Barstow's. Rebecca Eby would send her boys. I might have said this in a previous lecture, but I'm always struck by this. She would send her young boys, Ellison and Eason, with these great cans of butter. They called it a butter economy, and they would slog from where the ferry house is all the way to where the Captain Whidbey is with these big buckets of butter that would be traded for pork and other provisions. Butter was lingua franca because there weren't a lot. It was really, really hard to get and very expensive. Poor kids. They didn't have carts or horses. They had to carry it. So another thing that made Coveland a very busy place for a brief period in time was that both the U.S. District Courts and the Island County Courts were both run out of the old county courthouse. Well, it wasn't always. The old county courthouse was originally part of a trading business, but became quickly, at least in part of the building, the Island County Courthouse. So people would come from all over, especially for the district court. They'd be coming in from San Francisco. This is one of the reasons we had the ferry house, was because people had to go to district courts. They'd be coming from Port Townsend, and they would land at Eby's Landing and then have to find their way. So the ferry house became the landing space, where you could get supplies, where you could try to contract for transportation to Coveland, mail, and probably all kinds of shenanigans that didn't get recorded. So Grennan and Cranny, who originally owned the old county courthouse, also owned the sawmill over at Utsulati on Camino Island. And so these ships would come in full of things from foreign ports, and they would unload down at Barstow's or Grennan and Cranny's down in Coveland, and then they would come back to their mill and pick up timbers to take out. And these timbers would go to Europe, to the East Coast, even to China. So it was all about logging. It's so sad. One of the things that really struck me about when the Utsulati mill was running is that people would commute from Crescent Harbor, from Coveland. They would canoe. That was their commute to get over to Utsulati. Now you want to go to Utsulati, you got to lay out about 3 hours of travel time, which probably is maybe it's faster than canoeing it, but you certainly are using up a lot more fossil fuels to do it. They were off at Winfield. Eby is always rowing his boat from Eby's Landing to Port Townsend when he is works for customs. So he's going back and forth, especially when he and his brother are supplying the army at Fort Townsend. They're just in a perpetual traffic back and forth across the inlet. And there's this one great account in one of his journals where he was in Port Townsend and he was coming home and he rows all the way across Admiralty Inlet, and he gets to the beach and there's these two ladies that were dying to go to Port Townsend, and they had missed the ferry or the schooner, whoever was going, and so they begged. Winfield was kind of a sucker. They begged him to take him back over to Port Townsend. So he rowed them back to Port Townsend and then came back to Eby's Landing again. So, and he never got married. I'd have married that. So Captain Coupe is the first one to have his house in what is now Coupeville. You can probably see where it says Alexander. There is where the museum is. The wharf would be there if there were a wharf, but you can see where Captain Coupe's claim is over here, where he's got his house and his orchards. And this is a little path that's coming up from the south to his house. That's your main trail of transportation. So Alexander is right on his heels. And through the really not much in the way of white habitation in the 1850s, except that a man named Thomas Dow built a house not far from where the Haller House is, to the east of the Haller House. And then John Robertson, where the Seaside Salon is, he built a building there and a house. And what's that? Oh, I see. I'm losing my way. That was actually Raphael Brunn. Where the Haller House is right here. Raphael Brunn built the very first commercial establishment on Front Street here in 1859, built the first wharf and warehouse and mercantile store. John Robertson helped him, lived with him while he did it. So there's a real connection between the Robertsons and the Brunns and starting the commercial life of Coupeville. So Robertson also opens up his store. Now, there's a lot of debate about which building is his store. You'll often see that it's the blue building, the Mad Crab building was Robertson's store. There's a nice plaque on it that says 1866 John Robertson's store. It's probably not. John Robertson's store is probably Toby's, and I'll show you why when we get there. So I don't want to say it too loud because somebody will get upset. And then the Hallers come in 1866, and they add their big two-story colonial onto Raphael Brunn's cabin there. So at the beginning of the Civil War, or at the end of the Civil War, this is all you have on Front Street between Captain Coop's house all the way down at the end of Front Street and where the museum is now. Not a lot of buildings. It's a dirt path. So 1866 is also the year that this picture was taken. This is clear evidence. There's a longhouse down on the beach or some kind of dwelling that the Lower Skagit are still living on the beaches here in 1866. The white house that you see in the background is John Alexander's cabin. It's not there anymore, but it is where the museum is. So if you were standing on that spot, the wharf would be right to your left directly. And that path you can see is going to go right up the hill to the town park. So, and yeah, there was a time in 1863 when a nephew of Captain Swift's came to visit, and he was not impressed with this little dive at all. He called it a godforsaken country, could not wait to get out of here. Said he had to walk from Captain Coop's house to Alexander's house, and it was just a horrible, dark, damp forest trail. I'm getting out of here. So the wonderful sketch that you see here, it's really hard to see, so I'll try to go over some of it for you. This was done, we think, in the mid-1870s. So it's the only documentation we have of what Coupeville looked like in the 1870s. Coveland is still the county seat. This is Main Street coming through here. Can you guys see that? Okay, because I can use the laser if it works better. So here, it's the silly mic. Okay, so here's Main Street. Here is what is now Pearson's store. It used to be Haller's store. This Aqua would be over here if Aqua were here, but actually the wharf is probably right off here. Haller's wharf is right off here. This is Robertson's dryer. I don't know if that's still here. This is where the Glenwood Hotel is, but it's just Robertson buildings, small buildings of his. Now this says it's a hall, which means it's probably the Good Templars Hall, which was built, I think, in 1873. So that's one of our clues about when this dates from. But from the Good Templars Hall, which is like where Back to the Island is, from there to Alexander Street is nothing but John Alexander's orchard. And Mother Fay's Hotel is here. Her little house is here. And John Alexander's house is still here. So no wharf, obviously. There's the Union, what is that? The Union store. So there's some kind of store here, another one here, a dryer here. And when I say dryer, I mean fruit dryer. And then I love this. It says, it looks like a boat. It says steamer, but it appears to be on the land. So like a beached vessel that was just left there to decompose. And then this wonderful little ditch. It's just a ditch. And if you're ever in the wintertime walking down Alexander Street, you notice that it tends to percolate water. It seeps there. They may have fixed it, but I remember it. There's obviously some kind of seep or spring there that makes it difficult to keep it dry. Okay, so the earliest photograph of the waterfront that we have is this one, which dates back to 1884. And you can see here is the Good Templars Hall. Here is now the Central Hotel. There's some great shots of the Central Hotel. And here is Toby's with Robertson's Wharf here. And you can see there's no Mad Crab or Blue Building here, but this is definitely Toby's. And then John Robertson's house is back here. Now over here is where the Haller compound is, and I'm going to zoom in on that so that you can see. Here's a Haller house, not dark brown, as you can tell. And then the Haller Mercantile. This is the only image we have of the Haller Mercantile before it was torn down. And then Haller's Wharf is in the background with the warehouse on it. This is John Robertson's later longer wharf that came. You may know the story of what happened to the Haller Mercantile. It was after Haller had sold it to Daniel Pearson. This little road here, Main Street, was kind of narrow, and Island County decided they wanted to widen it. And there was a store there, and the store was in the way. And what do you do when the owner doesn't care about your wide roads? Well, you wait till he's out of town, and then you cut his building in half. So that was kind of the end. Daniel Pearson had leased the space out. The storekeeper went bankrupt, needless to say, and eventually the property was sold, and a whole new building was put there, a big warehouse, and which ultimately became the Circuit movie theater. So I'll show you some pictures of that next week. It's one of the most hilarious looking theaters in the world. So out of town, what's going out on the prairie? Well, like I said before, Isaac Eby didn't have tools. He didn't have a lot of heavy duty. When he first came, he didn't have any animals. They began to raise beef, but the settlers didn't eat beef very often because to kill a cow gave you a lot of meat, and you didn't have enough people or refrigeration to keep it. So they didn't start raising beef until they had places to sell it to. In the Eby's case, it was the US Army at both Fort Bellingham and Fort Townsend. But so when you look at these wonderful old photographs of the prairie, this is long after when they've got the capacity to really cultivate these huge tracts of land. Eby himself said he had only a hoe and the strength and will to work. So by the 1860s, they are fast creating what's going to be one of the great bread baskets of the West here. Whidbey Island was famous for its bumper crops of wheat. Even as early as 1860, the wheat, oats, and potatoes were their biggest crops, but they grew it all: barley, buckwheat, rye, hay, sweet potatoes, peas, beans, and fruit, all to augment the primary grains. And as there are more and more people to buy beef, cattle becomes the most profitable market. So the good news and bad news about the newfangled farming equipment, is that it not only makes it easier for people in the Northwest to farm, but it also makes it easier for people in California to farm. Excuse me. All the advances in dryland farming, before the Civil War, California had a very hard time growing enough food for its people because they didn't have enough water. And the same was true in Eastern Washington. But as soon as the technology catches up, as you know, the Eastern Washington and California really knows how to grow its own food. So but they did have great advances here. They were able to do more here because of the new reapers and mowers and threshing machines that were being invented back east and shipped out here. So things are going to slowly start to try to civilize around here. You've got an economy that's working. Now it's time to build some roads. Everybody's going everywhere by canoe up until this time. And the forest is pretty impenetrable, but I love these pictures of old Whidbey roads. They're just so evocative. It's not quite like Route 20 is today. They're going to start with schools. Got to get those kids educated. So, of course, in the beginning, there were traveling school teachers, but we had a couple of really great women here. The earliest schools were over in Smith Prairie. And Julia Kinney was the school teacher. She married Ernest Hancock. And she was going about as one of our first superintendents of schools in Island County. And she would make her rounds in a canoe and on horseback. Nellie Moore Coop is one of ours over at the Haller House. She is the niece of, she married a Coop, but her maiden name, Nellie Moore, she was Granville Haller's niece from York, Pennsylvania. And at the end of the Civil War, he told her, or at the end of his time out there, he told her that if he would send her to school at the best academy in Baltimore if she would agree to come out and teach his children out here. And she took him up on it. She came out here. She could teach anything. She could teach Latin, geometry, algebra, history, piano, cello. She was just an incredible woman and teacher. And she held school at the Haller House. And people sent their kids from all over to go to Miss Nellie's school, even from as far away as Bellingham. And she became quite famous for it. Now, one of the students that came from Bellingham was a student named John Roeder. And if you know anything about Bellingham, you know that Roeder is the name of the first entrepreneurs up there in Whatcom that really established Bellingham. They had the mill, Roeder's Mill, Roeder's Chuckanut Sandstone Quarry. I mean, he was the mover and shaker, the founder of Bellingham. And so he sent his son down, and as a result, she was invited up to Whatcom. And after she had married Thomas Coop, with all her connections up at Whatcom with the Roeder family and beyond, she started teaching school up there, and she became the first superintendent of schools of Whatcom County when it first broke away from Skagit County. So first woman for sure, and one of the earliest superintendents. And I was told up there, I gave a talk up in Bellingham last week, and they said, "Oh, you don't have to tell us who Nellie Moore is. We know Miss Nellie." So churches, what did they do about churches? It took a long time to have the financial wherewithal for churches, but you'll see, I find especially pervasive in the EB journals in the early years, as if only they could have church, things would be so much easier if only they could have their congregational support. And whenever a traveling minister would come through, they would put him up and treat him with royalty, and they would note it in their journals how great it was to have a real sermon and have everybody come. And generally people had it in their homes. When you consider the kind of lives that they led and they left behind, the EBs in particular are most heartbreaking to me, because when they moved out here, and the EB family moved out here, first Isaac came, and then he sent for his brother and his sisters and his wife and his children and his parents, and they all came out. But he was one of 13 children, and by the time the family came out here, they left 9 of them in the cemeteries back in Missouri. So the idea of being a mother of 13 kids and burying 9 of them, and she got to bury more after they got here. So it was the need to have a strong church community was really important for them. And Rebecca was left in her journal what it was like without a church. We are spending this Sabbath in reading most of the time. All around seems beautifully adorned in quiet serenity. Although we have not towering churches yet, we can spend our time in training the young minds of our children in the principles of Christianity and creating within them a thirst for moral knowledge in place of running from place to place in bad company. This is indeed a great blessing. The liberty of training our children in the way they should go, that they may be a blessing to us in their old age. This is so not contemporary, but this is the way that their journals really read, how important it is to them. The first real actual buildings that they have, in 1860 near Prairie Center, they have a little building where they hold some services. And then Thomas Coop gives them land near the schools, where the schools are now, for a church. But they don't actually get to build the Methodist church or the church that we know now, I think was built in 1894. A previous one had burnt down, but the first real church building is going to be built here in 1884, which is 30 years after Rebecca has pined on the prairie for a real church community. So social life, how could they possibly be having any fun? Did you, any of you read yet Hattie Swift's letters back to Massachusetts? She's this, Hattie and Louise Swift were one of our sea captain's second young wife and daughter. So they're young women. I think the daughter is the stepdaughter of the young mother. So they're not that far apart. The mom and the daughter are closer in age than the mom and the dad. But she writes the most cheerful, uplifting accounts of what life is like here, what they're eating, where they're shopping, who the characters in town are, what things cost. She wants to fix people up with eligible bachelors. She's just a teenage girl, like she's just very effervescent and charming. And when you read her letters that are collected and saved, I think they're at the University of Washington, you get to really like her. And then all of a sudden they stop because she and her mother contracted, I think it was a cholera epidemic right here on Whidbey, and they both died within 2 weeks. All that cheerfulness and then silence. It really just, even as 150 years later, it still sort of hits you. But balls were really big. I think there's actually a slide about that, so I'm not going to say balls were really big yet. But it was obviously fraternal organizations were a big part of the life of the men here. The Masons, this is, I think it's Lodge 19, the Whidbey Lodge that is still on Main Street. This is an older picture of it before it got its columns from the old bank in Oak Harbor. But that was built in the 1860s. And I know I'm name dropping again, but the first Grand Master was Granville Haller. So he was not very far. And so I love talking to Masons who study their lodge history, because Haller was pretty wealthy. He got wealthier and wealthier, having done all the land speculating and the building of the mills and all that while he was out here. But he lent a lot of money. He was kind of like the old man Potter, from It's a Wonderful Life, where everybody has their mortgage from old man Potter, but he was a little bit better natured than that. Not as notorious a figure. But at any rate, he's apparently developed a reputation with the Masons as the Grand Master of quitting in disgust. and then they would have to designate a particular brother to go down the street to his house and beg him to come back because he had all the money. So I think he might have been a little bit of an imperious fellow. So that's what it looks like today. The Good Templars Hall, and this is a picture that was taken much later than the period we're talking about, probably the 1880s. Coupeville has got all kinds of buildings on it that it didn't, but I included it because the building that you see here is the Good Templars Hall. And that's the hall where so much of their social life in the 1860s and or the 1870s and 80s is taking place in this hall. So it's a huge part of. And this was where the Penn Cove Art Gallery is now. So yeah, I talked about balls. So there's one thing I did right. Louise Swift, this is the stepmother. She writes home, "We have more balls in this country than at home, and always have a supper." And Winfield describes a great Christmas. "I spent most of the day at the Ferry House. There was quite a crowd there. Several came over from Port Townsend to attend the ball at Coupeville tonight. We had quite a dinner. The boys ran several foot races, and the crowd dispersed, most of them going to Coupeville. I presume by this time they are tripping the light fantastic in full tide." That is 1863. I know that from memory, but obviously it's got a little thing in front of it. I'm sorry. Can I move her? Yes, there we go. Yes. Tripping the Light Fantastic was was one of my favorite phrases. Winfield uses it all the time. Winfield is really shy, and he gets talked into going to these balls sometimes, but he's absolutely miserable. And he said later in that journal entry, I can't bear all those people being social, and I'm so uncomfortable. So I'm just going to stay home. It's like, oh, Winfield. So this is sad to us, because out of the Jacob Eby house, there are panels that show pictures of various members of the Eby family. And there's only one photograph of Winfield Eby, because he died at 33 of tuberculosis. But he's an extremely adorable person. And so when visitors come into the Jacob Eby house and take a look at who's that? But he was not good with the ladies. So what's making, so you can see that slowly, as people are moving into a kind of a normalized social life, they're not worried about Indian raids anymore. The Civil War is over. They're having a calmer life. And now the Northern Pacific Railroad is coming out from the east. And this poster's from 1873. And trying to coax people, get a home in the fertile Northwest. We will gladly help you to investigate. No obligation involved. 1873 was a year that the railroad finally decided, there was a big battle between Coveland and Coupeville as to who was going to get the rail, where it was going to be terminated. And Coupeville won, and that was a big move amongst settlers to kind of disinvest from Coveland and move their operations to where it is now. Of course, there was a big economic crash in 1873, and in the end, the railroad never came. But the move had begun. There were still, even at that date, quite a lot of Native people working in the workforce out here. There were, and I think in the 1880 census, there were 250 Native people who were working in various jobs here on Whidbey. They were loggers, they were farmers, they were domestics, they were fishermen, but they were involved in the economy, in the white economy, and living here. But by 1890, those numbers had been cut in half. So they're slowly over the years moving off towards the reservations. And so we'll see next week that as the Native workforce starts to decline, then we're going to see the rise of Chinese labor on Whidbey Island. But that's for next week.
Do you know where that house was?
This is actually a poster put out by the Northern Pacific Railroad. It could be anywhere in the West. It's not of Whidbey Island, but it does say, if you can read that small, get a home in the fertile Northwest. So I chose it. Their offices were in Minnesota. I'm sorry. It'll stop at 4. So Coveland is going to start to dry up. 1879. I have to include this because you might remember that our gallant Major Haller had some trouble with Secretary of War Stanton during the Civil War and had been dismissed without charges, without a court-martial, for allegedly making disloyal statements about Abraham Lincoln. The whole time he was living out here, from 1863 to 1879, he was lobbying Congress for a court-martial. He wanted a trial. He wanted to exonerate himself. And finally, in 1879, he got it. He was exonerated. And much to my amusement, there were wild celebrations all over out here. He returned in July of 1879. He first came into Port Townsend, and as the Jefferson County, the Puget Sound Argus said, that he had a number of citizens, upon his arrival, there was a perfect ovation. The mayor and councilmen went down and received him officially on board the steamer. A number of citizens also met him on the wharf, the band having marched down too and saluted the incoming steamer. After landing, a procession was formed, and the colonel was escorted to the Central Hotel, where he appeared on the balcony surrounded by friends. They wrote poems that were read at this event. And by the time he got up to speak, he was so overcome with emotion that nobody could hear him talk. But the next day he came to Coupeville, and on reaching Eby's Landing, a large concourse of citizens of Whidbey Island met them, and having formed in procession, drove to Coupeville, where a salute of 21 guns was fired. Flags were displayed and all the public buildings ornamented with bunting. At 3 p.m., the citizens gave him a reception in Good Templars Hall, where eloquent addresses were delivered suitable to the occasion. At sunset, a salute was also fired, and the day concluded with a ball in the evening. At least 150 persons were present. What I love about this is a guy that until we started digging out his house, I couldn't find anybody around here who had ever heard of him. But at one time, everybody knew who he was. So, oh yeah, these. I was just going to do a quick, because it's kind of, I'm gearing up for the last class. I just wanted to show you some of the buildings that would have been built during this time that are still standing. And maybe you will know some of them. This was one of Captain Henry Smith's house that used to be over at Santa Fuca, but was moved to Coupeville by the Swift family. And this is on the path from Front Street up to the town park. So if you've ever gone by that, that's the oldest house in Washington State. It's a square, hand-hewn square logs. This is Captain Coop's house a couple of years ago before it got repainted. As you can see, it's on treacherous footing on the bluff there, but there used to be, Front Street used to go in front of the house, and there used to be a blacksmith shop on the other side of the street. So that gives you an idea of how much of the bluff has been lost since 1854. And I have pictures of it. I'll show you next week. There's our Island County courthouse, also known as Grinning and Crannies, 1855. Jacob Eby House. If you haven't been there, you should, even though it's only open in the summer. And then the Engel Farmhouse on Eby and Terry Roads, 1858. The reason it may not look familiar to you is because today it looks like this. So this is one of Historic Whidbey's pet projects. We are working with the Engel family to try to find ways to help them to bring their farmhouse back.
After we pulled the vines off?
This was actually before, because it was years before. This was probably 10 years ago, because we couldn't get any good pictures of it because there was so much vegetation. I had to go back in time. But just to give you an idea of how important a house can be, even if its value isn't apparent. The current daughters who are slated to inherit this house in the not too distant future are the 7th generation of the family living in the house here. So the Ferry House, of course, if only we could get inside, right? This is the Samuel Crockett farmhouse up in Sierra, West Beach. You hardly ever get a good view of it. I mean Libby, I'm sorry, Samuel Libby. Yeah, yeah. This was when it was on the market a couple of years ago. Right. That's the Walter Crockett. There's the Crockett farmhouse down by the Crockett barn on the way to the ferry. It's beautiful. Here's our Seaside Salon, 1864. So this is John Robertson's house. So one of the oldest on Front Street. And there's me getting in trouble, claiming this is John Robertson's mercantile store. This has been I'm sure all of you have noticed the incredible transformation of the Joseph Libby house on Main Street. I don't think it could possibly be more adorable than it is now. And this was very close to being lost. I can remember when I first came here in 2012, the talk was they were going for a demolition permit. So you need geeks like us who love historic houses to fight. This one is up on Hill Road. It was the Hills Brothers. The Hills Brothers. It's not a coffee company. It's some of the first settlers that were here in the early 1850s were Hills Brothers from New Jersey. This one is on Zylstra Road, the powerhouse. It's been changed quite a bit, but there are some elements still of its original. It's kind of similar to the Haller House in that it's Sarah Steen calls it an I house because it was a kind of house that was being built very rapidly in states that began with I. So Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, in the after the Civil War, all these houses. And what they are is they look kind of like two-story colonials. They're symmetrical with a door in the middle, but they're only one room deep. So they're never quite as big as they look from the street because they don't go that deep. But anyway, that's for the architects in the room. And this is out by Penn Cove Pottery. This is Captain Holbrook's house from 1874. And even though the house is from 1874, Captain Holbrook was here in the 1850s. So he has left his mark here too. The Terry House, 1860. Do I have the year right, Lee?
Yep.
Good.
We found newspapers that suggest that the single story part's 1864.
Okay.
And then the addition, the larger part of the house, was put on in 1884 when Charles Terry married the second time. It's amazing what getting married can do.
So Lee currently owns this house, so nobody knows it better than he does. So it's just the small part from 1864, huh? This guy here. Wow. Yeah. Okay. This is on 9th Street, about 2 blocks in from Main Street, the Griffith Brooks house, 1869. And of course, the Haller House, 1866 and 1859. We have a really terrific legacy here. And I think that we need to all keep in mind how important each and every one of these is. When I was working on this, I found an article that went back to 2004, I think, and there was an 1868 house out on the way to off Engle Road or off Fort Casey Road, a farmhouse out there that had fallen into disrepair, and so the owner volunteered to let the fire department practice burning houses by burning down this 1868 farmhouse. And that's just, if you don't know the importance of the houses, if you don't know the stories that go with them, it's really easy to say, oh, that's going to cost a fortune, or it's not worth it, let's knock it down and build something new. But for this particular class of houses, those that are really the first couple of decades of our settlement here, I think we need to be vigilant, and that's what Historic Whidbey is trying to accomplish. So that is all I have for tonight.